Asterisk, asterisk, Part 1. The Shadow of a Lonely Cabin. Asterisk, asterisk. The wind on this stretch of land had a voice. It wasn't the gentle whisper that rustled the cottonwoods down by the creek, nor the lazy sigh that drifted through the pines in the high country. Here, where the forest frayed into a hard scrabble of rock and dust, the wind spoke with a raw, grating tongue. It scraped against the weathered planks of Caleb's cabin, moaning through the chinks in the daubing and rattling the single glass pane in the window like a restless spirit. It was a lonely sound, for a lonely place. The cabin itself seemed to have surrendered to the landscape. It sagged, its roofline dipping in the middle like the spine of an old swayback horse. The timber, once golden and proud, had been bleached by 100 seasons of sun and scoured by 1,000 storms into a uniform, skeletal gray. It stood on a slight rise, its back to the dense, dark woods and its face toward the sprawling, unforgiving badlands that stretched out to a horizon drawn with a shaky hand. A man could see for miles, which meant trouble could see him for miles. 2. Caleb figured that was a fair trade. He had built this place with Sarah, his late wife, in a time when hope was still a tool he used as readily as his axe. They had chosen the spot for the spring that trickled from the rocks 100 yards away, and for the shelter the forest offered from the worst of the winter gales. Now, the spring was just a place he hauled water from, and the forest was a place he hunted in. The hope had been buried with Sarah, down in the small, fenced-off plot behind the cabin, marked by a simple wooden cross that the wind was slowly trying to erase. Caleb moved with the stiff, deliberate economy of a man who measured his days by the rising and setting of the sun, and nothing more. At 40, his face was a roadmap of hardship, carved by sun and sorrow. His beard was thick and threaded with gray. His hands were broad and calloused, the knuckles swollen from work and cold. But it was his eyes that told the truest story. They were the color of a winter sky, pale and distant, holding a quiet grief that had long since settled into a permanent state of watchfulness. He trusted the flight of a hawk, the track of a deer, the feel of an axe handle in his palm. He did not trust people. People brought promises, and promises had a way of turning to dust, just like everything else. The cabin needed help. It was a fact as plain and unadorned as the landscape. The roof leaked in 3 places. The corral fence was down on the west side where a bear had blundered through it last spring, and the woodpile was shrinking faster than the days. He was one man against the slow, steady erosion of time and nature, and he was losing. The thought of hiring help was a bitter pill. It meant chatter. It meant another presence in the silence he had so carefully cultivated. It meant opening a door, however slightly, to a world he had shut out. He'd ridden into the nearby town of Redemption, a name far too optimistic for the dusty collection of storefronts and saloons it was, and tacked a notice to the board outside the general store. Asterisk, help wanted, hard work, room and board provided. He didn't mention pay. If a man was desperate enough to come this far out, he wouldn't quibble over coin. But no one came. The weeks passed. Caleb's shoulders ached a little more each morning, and the wind's lonely song seemed to grow louder. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Down in Redemption. Emma Thorne was just as familiar with the wind, but for her, it whispered of escape. It carried the scent of distant rain and the promise of places that weren't this dusty, stifling town. At 19, she felt as trapped as a bird in a shoebox. Her world was the small, crowded house she shared with her parents and 2 younger brothers, a place that always smelled of boiled cabbage and damp wool. Her future, as her mother constantly reminded her, was to find a respectable, hard-working man to marry someone who wouldn't drink his wages away and who might one day own a slightly larger house that would also smell of boiled cabbage. The prospect was a kind of slow death to Emma. She wasn't built for it. She had her father's wiry strength and a stubborn streak that was all her own. While other girls practiced their stitches, Emma learned how to set a snare and how to swing an axe without wasting motion. She was practical, sharp-eyed, and possessed a quiet determination that was often mistaken for foolishness by those who didn't know her. She saw the notice for help at Caleb's cabin. She heard the talk. "It's that widower, Caleb Miller." She heard Mr. Abernathy, the store owner, say to a customer, "Place is half wild. No decent man wants to work for a ghost out in the middle of nowhere." "They say he's mean as a rattler," the woman replied, clutching her bag of flour. "And strange, hasn't spoken more than 10 words in a row since his wife passed. It's no place for anyone." The more she heard, the more the idea took root. Asterisk, no place for anyone. That was precisely what made it a place for her. It was a way out. It was a challenge. Her father had been laid up with a busted leg for a month, and what little money they had was dwindling. Marrying the doughy-faced baker's son was looking more and more like a necessity, a thought that made her stomach clench. Working for the strange widower was a risk, but staying was a certainty she couldn't bear. One morning, before the sun had fully crested the hills, she made her decision. She packed a small bundle with her only spare dress, a hunk of bread, and the skinning knife her father had given her. She left a note on the kitchen table, a few simple lines saying she had gone to find work and would send money when she could. She didn't say where. They wouldn't understand. The walk to Caleb's cabin was longer than she'd expected. The dusty road gave way to a faint track, and the track eventually disappeared altogether, leaving her to navigate by the sun and the shape of the hills. The air grew thinner, the silence deeper. She saw a coyote slip between the rocks, its yellow eyes watching her for a moment before it vanished. This was a different world from the town. It was stark and beautiful and dangerous, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt her own heart beating in rhythm with it. She saw the cabin first as a smudge of gray against the dark green of the pines. As she drew closer, she saw the neglect, the crooked tilt of the chimney, the weeds choking what might have once been a garden. A man was out front, splitting logs. His back was to her, but she could see the power in the swing of his axe, the clean, satisfying crack as the wood gave way. He moved without pause, a machine of muscle and rhythm, and she stopped at the edge of the clearing, her throat suddenly dry. This was it. She took a breath, smoothed the front of her worn calico dress, and walked forward. The sound of her footsteps on the hard-packed earth made him stop mid-swing. The axe hung in the air for a second before he lowered it, resting its head on the chopping block. He turned slowly. He was exactly as the townspeople had described, and yet, not at all. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and bearded, but his eyes, when they met hers, weren't mean. They were just empty, wary, like a room that hadn't seen a visitor in years. "Lost?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, rough from disuse. "No," Emma said, forcing herself to stand straight, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I saw your notice in town. I've come about the work." Caleb stared at her. He looked from her face to her small bundle, then to her hands, which she had balled into fists at her sides. A flicker of something disbelief. Maybe annoyance crossed his face. "The notice was for help," he said, his tone flat. "A hired man." "It said help," Emma corrected him, her voice steadier now. It didn't specify the gender. "I can work. I can chop wood, mend a fence, patch a roof. I can cook and clean. I'm stronger than I look, and I don't scare easy." He was silent for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical weight. He was sizing her up, judging her, and she could feel him finding her wanting. A young woman, alone, miles from anywhere. It made no sense. To him, she was a problem, a complication he didn't need. "This is no place for a girl," he said finally, turning back to his chopping block as if the conversation were over. "It's not for you to decide what place is for me," Emma shot back. a spark of her own temper flaring. I need the work. You need the help. It seems simple enough to me. That made him pause again. He slowly rested the axe against the block and faced her fully. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the fierce light in her brown eyes. She wasn't begging, and she wasn't flirting. She was stating a fact, and he couldn't deny the truth of it. His back ached, the roof leaked, and winter was coming. He was tired of being alone with the work, even if he preferred being alone with his thoughts. You have any family? He asked, his voice a shade softer. A test. I do, she said, not elaborating. She wouldn't use them as a sob story. They know you're here. I'm of age. It's my decision. He grunted, a sound that wasn't quite agreement or disagreement. He walked over to the woodpile and picked up a smaller axe, the kind used for splitting kindling. He held it out to her. Handle first. Let's see it. Then. It was a test, a dismissal in the form of a challenge. He expected her to be clumsy, to swing wide, to prove his point. Emma took the axe. The handle was smooth from use, balanced perfectly. It felt right in her hands. She selected a round of wood, set it on the block, and took a stance just as she'd seen her father do 1,000 times. She took a breath, focused on the center of the log, and brought the axe down in one clean, fluid motion. Asterisk thwack, asterisk. The wood split perfectly in two. She didn't look at him for approval. She simply set the two halves aside, placed another log on the block, and split it just as cleanly. Caleb watched, his expression unreadable. He had expected weakness, maybe tears. He had not expected competence. He had not expected the quiet fury of her determination. She was thin, but she moved with a core of strength. He was a man who understood the language of hard work, and she was speaking it fluently. Still, his mind rebelled. A woman, here, in this cabin filled with the ghost of another woman. It felt wrong. It felt dangerous. Not a physical danger, but a danger to the walls he'd built around his heart. There are rules, he said gruffly, breaking the silence. Emma stopped, resting the axe head on the block and looking at him. I work you from sunup to sundown. You earn your keep. There's a small room in the back. It's yours. You do the cooking, the mending, and you help me with whatever needs doing outside. No visitors, no idle chatter. When I tell you to do something, you do it. Can you live with that? It was a harsh bargain, an offer stripped of all warmth or welcome. It was exactly what Emma needed. It wasn't charity. It was a job. An exchange. I can, she said, her voice clear and strong. All right then, Caleb said, turning away from her as if the matter was already tiring him. Start by stacking that wood you just split. Stack it neat against the east wall. The rain comes from the west. He picked up his own axe and went back to his work, the steady rhythm of his swings resuming as if she weren't even there. The interview was over. She was hired. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She looked from Caleb's broad, uncommunicative back to the looming, silent cabin. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind ran down her spine. The cabin door was a dark, unwelcoming rectangle. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a great, unknown darkness. But it was a darkness she had chosen. She picked up an armful of split wood and walked toward the cabin, her new home, ready to prove her worth in the shadow of its loneliness. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 2. The Fire and the Harsh Work, asterisk, asterisk. The days that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the seemingly endless list of chores. There was no gentle waking in Caleb's cabin. Dawn did not creep. It shattered the darkness, spilling a cold, gray light through the window that served as their alarm. Emma's room was little more than a closet off the main living space, containing a narrow cot stuffed with straw and a single wooden peg for her spare dress. The cold from the floorboard seeped into her bones each morning, a constant reminder that comfort was a luxury this land did not afford. Work began before words. Caleb would already be up, stoking the embers in the hearth. He moved with a heavy, grudging silence. And their breakfasts were Spartan affairs, hard biscuits, sometimes a strip of salted bacon, and coffee boiled until it was thick and bitter. He ate quickly, his eyes focused on the table, and as soon as he was done, he would rise, grab his hat, and head for the door. His first words of the day were always in order: the west fence, or we need more firewood. Chop what's there, I'll haul another log down. Emma learned to follow his lead, to speak only when necessary. The silence of the cabin was a living thing, heavy with the unspoken grief of his past and her own uncertain future. But the silence of the land was different. It was filled with the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above, and the ceaseless, scouring voice of the wind. At night, the wolves would sing their haunting chorus from the dark ridges of the forest, a sound that made the small flame in the hearth seem both terribly fragile and defiantly precious. This world was raw, stripped of all pretense, and in its brutal honesty, Emma began to find a strange sense of belonging. She threw herself into the work with a ferocity born of desperation and pride. Her hands, already calloused, soon blistered, then bled, then healed into a tough, leathery shield. Caleb had been right. The ground was harder than a preacher's heart. Digging post holes for the new corral fence was a battle against rock and root. She would heave the heavy digger, slamming it into the unyielding earth, her muscles screaming in protest. Caleb worked beside her, his movements a study in efficiency. He never wasted emotion, never swung the maul harder than he needed to. He watched her struggle for the better part of an hour, her face flushed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, he stopped. "You're fighting it," he said, his voice flat. "You're trying to muscle it. The ground won't be muscled." He took the digger from her, positioned it, and with a sharp, focused thrust that used the weight of his whole body, not just his arms, he drove the blades deep. It's about leverage. Let the tool do the work. He handed it back to her without another word. There was no praise in his tone, only the cold logic of an instructor. Emma's cheeks burned with a mix of shame and frustration, but she bit back a retort. She watched him, mimicked his stance, and focused on the technique. It was still brutally hard work, but he was right. The tool, used properly, became an extension of herself. She learned. Patching the roof was the next trial. It was a dizzying, dangerous task. Caleb insisted on tying a rope around her waist, anchoring the other end to the solid stone chimney. "A fall from here breaks more than your pride," he grunted, and it was the closest he'd come to expressing any concern for her well-being. She crawled across the sun-baked shingles, the rough wood snagging at her dress, and worked the tar into the cracks he pointed out from below. The world looked different from up there, vast and lonely. The cabin a tiny, vulnerable raft in an ocean of wilderness. He was a demanding taskmaster. Her stacks of firewood were never straight enough. Her stitches on his torn shirt were not small enough. The stew she'd made was either too salty or not salty enough. Yet, beneath the constant, gruff criticism, Emma began to perceive a deep current of fairness. He worked harder than she did, taking on the most grueling tasks himself. He never ate until she had taken her portion, and when a splinter went deep into her palm, he silently held the lantern steady while she dug it out with her knife, his large hand hovering near hers, ready to help if she faltered. 2 weeks into her stay, the need for supplies became unavoidable. Caleb announced his intention to ride into redemption. The idea of being left alone for an entire day filled Emma with a quiet dread. The cabin felt safe only with his solid, capable presence. "I'll come with you," she said, more a statement than a question. He scowled. "No need. You'll stay here." "And do what talk to the squirrels," she countered, a rare spark of defiance in her voice. "You need help carrying the supplies back. It's more practical." He hated that she was right. He hated the idea of riding into town with her, of facing the inevitable stares and whispers. It was an intrusion, a violation of the privacy he guarded so fiercely, but he couldn't deny her logic. With a low curse, he relented. The ride to redemption was tense and silent. As they neared the town, Emma could feel a knot tightening in her stomach. She had left without a word, and now she was returning in the company of the town's resident hermit. The reaction was exactly what they'd expected. As they rode down the main street, conversation stopped. Doors creaked open. Faces appeared in windows. The women stared with a mixture of pity and contempt, whispering behind their hands. The men looked at Caleb with a new, unwelcome familiarity, their leering grins making Emma's skin crawl. Inside the general store, the air was thick with unspoken judgment. "Mr." Abernathy polished the counter with a vigor that was entirely for show. "Caleb," he said, his voice oozing a false heartiness. "Good to see you, and Miss Thorne." He acknowledged her with a stiff nod. "Heard you'd gone off looking for work. Looks like you found it." The implication hung in the air, thick and ugly. Emma held her head high, her chin set stubbornly. She looked him square in the eye. "I did, Mr. Abernathy. The work is hard, and the pay is fair." She busied herself with a list of goods: flour, salt, beans, nails. A new axe head while Caleb conducted his business in clipped, terse sentences. They worked quickly, enduring the suffocating weight of the town's disapproval, and were soon loaded up and riding out again. The silence on the ride back was different. It was no longer just empty space between two strangers. It was a shared fortress against the world they had just left behind. Caleb's shoulders were set in a rigid line, his jaw tight. Emma found herself feeling a surprising surge of protectiveness toward this grim, solitary man. They had judged him without knowing him, just as they had judged her. In that moment, they were allies. They were a mile from the cabin when the world changed. The wind, which had been a constant companion, suddenly died. An eerie, unnatural stillness fell over the land. The sky, once a brilliant blue, began to bruise, turning a sickly shade of yellow-green along the horizon. Birds stopped singing. Caleb reined in his horse, his head tilted, sniffing the air like an animal. "Trouble," he muttered, his eyes scanning the sky. A spring squall, a bad one. The word was barely out of his mouth before the temperature plummeted. A low, menacing rumble echoed from the west. "Go!" he yelled, spurring his horse into a gallop. "Get to the cabin." They raced the storm, the wind rising behind them with a demonic shriek. They reached the clearing just as the first drops of rain, hard and cold as pellets of ice, began to fall. They scrambled to unload the supplies and get the horses into the small, sturdy lean-to. By the time they slammed the cabin door shut, the storm hit with the force of a physical blow. It was a nightmare of sound and fury. The wind howled like a legion of banshees, and the cabin groaned and shuddered under the assault. Rain hammered against the roof and walls, not falling but driven horizontally, finding every crack and seam. Darkness descended, plunging the cabin into a terrifying twilight, lit only by strobing flashes of lightning. Then came a sound that made them both freeze, a loud crack, followed by a splintering groan from above. One of her freshly patched sections on the roof had failed. A torrent of water began to pour onto the floor near the hearth. The flour Caleb roared over the din. They worked in frantic, synchronized motion. Emma dragged the precious sacks of flour and beans to the driest corner while Caleb, grabbing a lantern, climbed onto a wooden crate. The hole was a ragged tear, the wind and rain ripping at it, making it wider. "The oilcloth under the bed," he shouted. Emma scrambled to retrieve it, her hands shaking. The floor was already slick with water. She held the lantern high, its flickering light casting monstrous, dancing shadows, as Caleb fought to stuff the hole with the oilcloth and spare rags. A powerful gust of wind tore at the roof, and he lost his balance, his foot slipping on the wet crate. "Caleb," she cried out. He caught himself on a roof beam, grunting with the effort, without thinking. Emma dropped the lantern and rushed to steady the crate, her shoulder pressed against his leg. Adding her weight to his, he looked down, his eyes wide in the wild, flickering light. For a heart-stopping second, they were frozen, a team, bound by the chaos, her small frame bracing his. He regained his footing and resumed his work, jamming the cloth into the hole with a desperate fury. The torrent slowed to a steady, manageable drip. The worst of the storm raged for another 20 minutes, and then, as suddenly as it had arrived, it moved on, leaving behind a profound, dripping silence. They stood in the middle of the cabin, soaked to the bone, chests heaving. Water puddled on the floor. The air smelled of rain, wet wood, and ozone. The single lantern cast a warm, golden glow on the scene of their shared battle. Caleb slowly climbed down from the crate. He looked at the leaking roof, at the soaked floor, and then he looked at her. He truly looked at her, and for the first time, the emptiness in his eyes was replaced by something else. Acknowledgement, respect. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "You did good," he said, his voice low and rough. It wasn't much, just 3 simple words. But from this man, in this place, it felt like the highest praise Emma had ever received. A small, tentative flame of understanding had been lit in the heart of the storm, and in its fragile light, the lonely cabin felt just a little less dark. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 3. The Seeds of Trust, asterisk, asterisk. The storm had passed, but it had left its mark. The morning after broke clear and bright, the sky washed clean and a deceptive calm settling over the land. Inside the cabin, however, the aftermath was a scene of quiet chaos. A large puddle mirrored the new hole in the roof, and a damp, earthy smell clung to the air. The shared battle against the squall had changed something between them. The rigid lines of employer and hired hand had been blurred, replaced by the unspoken camaraderie of survivors. The silence that morning was not one of distance, but of shared exhaustion and a new, fragile understanding. Their first task was obvious. The roof could not be left to chance. A proper repair was needed, one that would stand against the next gale. "We'll need to cut new shingles," Caleb announced, his voice still raspy, "and re-tar the whole northern face. It's a 2-person job." It was a statement of fact, but for the first time, the phrase 2-person job felt less like a necessity and more like an admission of partnership. Working on the roof became their world for the next 3 days. It was a slow, meticulous process under the relentless sun. Caleb, surprisingly, became a patient teacher. He showed Emma how to split the cedar logs into uniform shingles, how to find the grain and use the froe and mallet to make a clean break. His instructions were still brief, but they lacked their former cutting edge. "Here, like this, keep the pressure even." He'd guide her hands, his touch rough but impersonal, focused only on the task. And yet, it was impossible to work so closely without a growing awareness of each other. They moved in a rhythm born of shared labor, passing the hammer, holding the ladder, their hands brushing occasionally. Each accidental contact sent a small, unexpected jolt through the air. Emma became attuned to the quiet language of his movements, the slight tensing of his shoulders when a shingle didn't sit right, the soft grunt of satisfaction when a nail drove home true. She saw the lines of concentration etched around his eyes and the way the sun brought out the lighter streaks in his graying hair. On the final day of the repair, it happened. Emma was reaching for a stack of shingles, her body twisted at an awkward angle. Her boot, worn smooth from months of wear, slipped on a loose nailhead. For a sickening moment, she was weightless, the vast, unforgiving ground rushing up to meet her. A sharp cry escaped her lips. Faster than thought, Caleb moved. He dropped his hammer with a clatter and lunged, his arm shooting out, His hand clamped around her wrist, his grip like a band of iron. The jolt as he took her full weight sent a shock through both of them. He grunted, his muscles straining as he pulled her back from the edge, hauling her onto the safety of the roof's peak. He didn't let go immediately. He held her there, his fingers wrapped firmly around her wrist, his other hand on her arm to steady her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, ringing silence. She looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. His face was inches from hers. His pale eyes, usually so distant, were blazing with a fierce, raw emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't just concern, it was alarm, sharp and deeply personal. The world seemed to shrink to that single point of contact, his calloused, warm hand on her skin. It was the first time they had touched not out of necessity or accident, but out of a primal, protective instinct. The moment stretched, charged with an unspoken current. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his pulse against her own. Then, as quickly as it came, the spell was broken. Caleb's expression shuddered, the familiar mask of stoicism falling back into place. He released her abruptly, almost pushing her away. "Be more careful," he said, his voice a low growl. He turned away, picking up his hammer, but she saw that his hand was unsteady. They finished the rest of the work in a thick, self-conscious silence, both acutely aware that a line had been crossed. A simple, shared task had become something more. In the weeks that followed, the entire homestead seemed to undergo a quiet revival, mirroring the change in the cabin's occupants. With the roof and fence secure, Emma turned her attention to the small plot of land she had claimed for a garden. The ground Caleb had called harder than a preacher's heart began to yield to her patient efforts. She hauled water from the spring, her shoulders aching, and protected the tender shoots from scavenging birds. One morning, she saw Caleb standing by the patch, looking at the tiny green sprouts pushing through the dark soil. He said nothing, but the next day, she found he had constructed a crude but effective fence around the plot to keep out the rabbits. The cabin itself began to transform under her touch. It was no longer just a shelter, a place to escape the elements. Emma scrubbed the grime from the floorboards until the wood grain showed through. She aired out the musty blankets in the sun and patched the holes in them with neat, even stitches. One afternoon, while walking back from the spring, she found a patch of Indian paintbrush, their fiery red blooms a startling splash of color against the drab landscape. On impulse, she picked a handful and put them in an old tin can on the table. When Caleb came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the flowers. A strange, pained expression flickered across his face. For a moment, Emma thought he was angry, that she had overstepped, bringing a frivolous, feminine touch to his Spartan world. "Sarah, she liked those," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He cleared his throat and sat down at the table, but he kept glancing at the simple bouquet, as if seeing a ghost. The walls around Caleb's heart, built of loss and solitude, were beginning to show cracks. The constant, quiet presence of Emma, her resilience, her competence, her stubborn refusal to be intimidated by him or the wilderness, was a gentle, persistent force he had not anticipated. He found himself watching her as she worked in her garden, humming a tuneless song, or as she sat by the fire in the evening, her face illuminated by the flames, mending his clothes. A part of him he had thought long dead and buried with his family began to stir with a faint, unfamiliar warmth. The breakthrough came on a cool evening, with a scent of pine on the night air. A fire crackled in the hearth, a bulwark against the encroaching darkness. Emma was kneading dough for the next day's bread, her movements rhythmic and soothing, to fill the silence. She began to hum a soft, simple melody, a lullaby her mother used to sing. Caleb, who had been oiling a rifle by the firelight, went completely still. The rag in his hand paused, his knuckles white. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of profound sorrow. Emma stopped humming, sensing the sudden shift in him. "Caleb," she asked softly, "are you all right?" He didn't look at her. He continued to stare into the fire, his shoulders slumped. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an old, unhealed grief. "That song," he said, his voice cracking. "Sarah used to sing that to our boy, Daniel." The name hung in the air between them. The first time it had been spoken aloud in years. Emma's hands stilled in the dough. She remained silent, her heart aching for him. She knew this was a sacred moment, a door opening into a place of immense pain. She simply waited, her quiet presence an invitation for him to continue, if he chose. And he did. The words came haltingly at first, like stones being pulled from a deep, cold well. He told her about Sarah, about her laugh that sounded like wind chimes, about the way she could make anything grow. He spoke of building this cabin with their own hands, of the dreams they had for a future, for a family. Then, his voice breaking, he spoke of Daniel, a bright, curious boy with his mother's smile and a love for chasing grasshoppers. He was only 4 when the fever came, a shadow that swept through the valley, taking the young and the old without mercy. "It took Daniel first," Caleb said, his gaze still fixed on the mesmerizing dance of the flames. "He was gone in 2 days. Sarah, she held on for a week. She kept calling for him. He finally looked up, and Emma was startled to see the raw, naked pain in his eyes, a pain he had hidden from the world for so long. There was nothing I could do. The doctor was a day's ride away, and he had nothing for it anyway. I sat with them. I held their hands, and then they were gone." He fell silent, the weight of his confession settling in the small cabin. He described how he had made the coffins himself, how he had dug the 2 small graves on the hill behind the cabin. The hardest work he had ever done. "I buried my whole world in that patch of ground." He finished, his voice hollow. Emma's eyes filled with tears, not of pity, but of a deep, profound empathy. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't say that time would heal him or that they were in a better place. She knew that words were useless against such a monumental loss. Instead, she dusted the flour from her hands, walked over to the hearth, and placed another log on the fire. The simple, domestic act was a promise of continuity, of warmth, of life going on. She sat on the small stool opposite him, her hands clasped in her lap, and simply met his gaze. Her silence was a testament, a shared space where his grief could exist without judgment. It said, "I see you. I hear you. You are not alone in this moment." He held her gaze, and in the depths of her compassionate brown eyes, Caleb saw not a hired girl, not an intruder, but a witness to his sorrow. A profound sense of release washed over him, the easing of a burden he had carried alone for too long. For the first time in years, the crushing weight on his chest seemed to lift, just a fraction. The fire crackled, casting its warm glow on the 2 figures. The ghosts of the past had been summoned and acknowledged. They were still there. They would always be there. But they no longer had to be faced alone. In the heart of the lonely cabin, a fragile seed of trust, nurtured by shared hardship and watered by honest tears, had finally taken root. Part 4. His lonely cabin needed help. She arrived. The confession of Caleb's past did not bring a pall of sadness over the cabin. Rather, it cleared the air, like a cleansing rain that settles the dust. With the ghosts of his grief finally acknowledged, a new, lighter atmosphere took root. The heavy silence that had once defined their existence was replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the easy, functional dialogue of 2 people who understood each other without the need for excess words. Their days fell into a seamless rhythm. They moved around each other with an unconscious grace, anticipating the other's needs. if Caleb was splitting the tough, knotted logs. Emma would appear with a whetstone for the axe before he even realized it had grown dull. When she struggled to turn the soil in her expanding garden, she would find a newly crafted, more ergonomic handle leaning against the spade the next morning. For the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb felt the stirrings of a future that was not simply an endless succession of lonely days. He found himself watching Emma, noticing the small details that made her who she was, the way she bit her lip in concentration when mending a tear, the fierce pride in her eyes when she pulled the first tender lettuces from her garden, the soft, unguarded expression on her face as she watched the sunset paint the Badlands in hues of orange and purple. A rare, rusty smile would sometimes touch his lips, a fleeting expression that Emma treasured like a rare wildflower. For her part, Emma felt a sense of belonging she had never known. The cabin was no longer Caleb's lonely shelter. It was their shared bastion against the wilderness. Her hands had helped rebuild it. Her care was making it thrive, this small patch of land, which the world saw as desolate and God-forsaken, had become her sanctuary. She had arrived seeking work and independence, but she was slowly, quietly, finding a home. Her respect for Caleb had deepened into something warmer, a fierce admiration for his resilience and a tender affection for the kind, wounded man beneath the gruff exterior. The seasons turned. The last vestiges of spring gave way to the dry, baking heat of summer. The land grew thirsty, the creek shrinking to a mere trickle. The days were long and filled with the relentless hum of insects and the shimmer of heat rising from the rocks. It was a time of hard, sweaty labor, of preserving what they could for the winter that always loomed in the back of their minds. They had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the land, but the West always held surprises. The warning came not from the sky, but from the animals. One sweltering afternoon, the cicadas abruptly fell silent. A nervous energy seemed to ripple through the forest. Squirrels chattered frantically and vanished, and a herd of deer, usually so skittish, bolted across the clearing in a blind panic. Caleb, who was reinforcing the corral, stopped dead, his head raised. He scanned the horizon. The sky to the north was a strange, bruised purple, a stark contrast to the brilliant blue overhead. The air was unnaturally still, heavy and thick, making it difficult to breathe. "Emma," he called out, his voice sharp with an urgency she had never heard before. "Get inside, now." She ran from her garden, wiping the sweat from her brow. "What is it?" "Norther," he said, his face grim. "A bad one. Look at that sky. It's going to be more than rain." This was different from the spring squall. There was a palpable sense of menace in the air, a feeling that the land itself was holding its breath. They worked with a frantic, disciplined haste born of their shared experience. There was no need for orders. Emma secured the shutters, jamming wedges of wood into the frames, while Caleb led the horses into the sturdy lean-to, double-checking the ropes. They hauled armfuls of firewood inside, stacking it high by the hearth, knowing a sudden drop in temperature would follow the wind. The storm front hit them like a physical blow. It was not rain, but a wall of wind and dust. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring, brown chaos. The temperature plunged. The summer heat instantly sucked away and replaced by a biting cold. The wind shrieked, a high, thin sound of pure malevolence, and the cabin began to tremble as if in the grip of a giant, angry beast. Inside, the noise was deafening. Dust forced its way through every tiny crack, filling the air with a gritty haze. The lantern flame flickered wildly. They could hear the sound of pebbles and debris being hurled against the walls like buckshot. Then came a sound louder than the rest, a deep, groaning crack from the west wall, the one that took the full brunt of the wind. A long, horizontal fissure appeared in the logs, widening before their eyes. With a deafening, splintering sound, one of the logs gave way, and the wind blasted into the cabin. A savage, focused assault that tore a hanging cookpot from its hook and sent it clattering across the floor. The table Caleb roared over the maelstrom. Together, they heaved the heavy, solid oak table, their muscles straining against its dead weight. They shoved it against the buckling wall, a desperate, makeshift brace. It wasn't enough. The wind pushed back, the entire cabin groaning in protest. "We need to wedge it," Emma shouted, her voice nearly lost in the roar. She saw at first the heavy wooden chest where Caleb kept his tools. It was their best hope. While Caleb put his entire body into holding the table in place, his boots sliding on the dusty floor. Emma scrambled to the chest. She threw it open, grabbing for hammers, for iron wedges, for anything that could be driven between the table and the floorboards. The wind howled through the new opening, tearing at her hair, trying to rip the tools from her grasp. She crawled back to Caleb, the cold, gritty spray of dirt and what felt like ice stinging her face. She saw the raw desperation in his eyes, the sheer physical effort it was taking him not to be thrown back. This was not a fight they could win with strength alone. The floor, she screamed, pointing, "Brace it against the floor joist." He understood immediately. It was her quick thinking, her ability to see the geometry of the problem in the midst of chaos. While he held the table with one arm, he took the largest wedge in the maul from her with the other. He positioned the wedge against the table leg and the solid joist beneath the floorboards. With 3 powerful, precise blows, he drove it home. The groaning of the wall lessened. They drove in another, then another. The immediate danger of collapse had been averted. They fell back, gasping for breath, their bodies slick with sweat despite the biting cold. But there was no time to rest. A new sound reached them, the sharp, percussive rattle of hail against the roof, followed by the sickening sound of the lean-to roof being torn away. "The woodpile," Caleb yelled. "Their fuel, their life for the coming winter." He looked at Emma, a question in his eyes. To go out into that was madness, but to lose the wood was a death sentence come winter. She just nodded, her jaw set. They waited for a momentary lull in the wind's fury, then threw open the door and plunged into the storm. The world was a nightmare of horizontal hail and screaming wind. It was impossible to see more than a few feet. They fought their way to the ruined lean-to, where the carefully stacked wood was already being scattered. They worked like mad things, grabbing armfuls of the precious logs, stumbling back to the cabin, throwing them inside, and then turning to go back out into the fray. Each trip was a battle against the elements, the hail stinging their faces, the wind trying to knock them from their feet. Finally, they managed to salvage most of it, piling it in a chaotic heap inside the cabin door. They slammed the door shut, barring it, and collapsed against it, their lungs burning, their bodies bruised and aching. The storm raged outside, but inside, they were safe. They had held the line. An hour later, the wind began to subside, its demonic shriek lowering to a mournful moan. The hail stopped. A watery, gray light began to filter through the dusty window. They had survived. The cabin was a wreck. Dirt and leaves covered everything. The floor was wet, and the great table was still wedged against the broken wall. But the fire in the hearth had survived. A small, defiant heart of warmth in the midst of the chaos. Caleb slowly, stiffly, got to his feet and added more of the wood they had just saved. The flames grew, pushing back the cold and the gloom. Emma, shivering, put a pot of coffee on to boil. They didn't speak. There were no words for what they had just been through. They moved around the disordered space, their exhaustion a heavy blanket. When the coffee was ready, they sat on a crate near the fire, cradling the hot tin mugs in their hands, letting the warmth seep into their chilled bones. Caleb stared into the flames for a long time. He looked at the braced wall, a testament to their desperate struggle. He looked at the pile of wood by the door, a symbol of their shared foresight. Then he looked at Emma. Her face was smudged with dirt. A small cut was bleeding on her cheek, and her hair was a wild, tangled mess. He had never seen her look more beautiful. He saw it all in that moment, the slow resurrection of this place from a tomb of memories to a living homestead. He saw the garden, the mended roof, the clean floors, the wild flowers in the can. He saw the capable, courageous woman who had faced down gossip, back-breaking labor, and the raw fury of nature without complaint. She had brought more than just help. She had brought life. His throat felt tight. He opened his mouth to say thank you, but what came out was something deeper, truer, a confession that welled up from the very depths of his soul. His voice was quiet, rough with emotion. "This lonely cabin needed help," he said, his gaze holding hers. "Then you arrived." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "And with you, Emma, it feels like home again." The words settled in the quiet room. As powerful and transformative as the storm they had just weathered, it wasn't a declaration of passion, not a flowery promise. It was a simple, profound truth. It was an admission that she had not just repaired his home, but had begun to heal his life. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, blurring the firelight. She didn't try to wipe them away. This was the acknowledgement she had never dared to hope for, the validation of every blister, every aching muscle, every moment of fear and doubt. He saw her. He truly saw her. A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She offered him a small, watery, brilliant smile in that shared, silent moment. Surrounded by the wreckage of the storm, something new and incredibly strong was forged between them. It was a love born not of courtship or sweet nothings, but of shared survival, mutual respect, and the quiet rediscovery of what it meant to have a home. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 5. The shadows outside asterisk, asterisk. In the aftermath of the great storm, a season of profound peace settled upon the homestead. The declaration that had passed between Caleb and Emma, though simple, had irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives. The love between them, now silently acknowledged, was a quiet but powerful force, evident in the way they moved, the way they worked, the way they simply existed in the same space. Rebuilding the damaged wall was no longer a chore, but a shared act of creation, their hands often brushing as they mixed the daub, sending a current of warmth between them that had nothing to do with the summer sun. Caleb's smiles, once a rarity, became more frequent small, private things meant only for her. He would watch as she tended her flourishing garden, a testament to her stubborn optimism, and a deep, unfamiliar contentment would settle in his chest. He was a man who had forgotten the language of joy, and Emma was teaching it to him again, word by word. For Emma, the cabin had become the whole world, the hard-won home, the fierce, gentle man who shared it with her. These were the anchors of her soul. The life she had fled in redemption seemed a distant, faded memory, a life that belonged to someone else. But the wilderness was not their only neighbor, and the peace they had cultivated was a fragile thing, grown in the lee of a world that did not understand or approve. The outside world arrived not with the roar of a storm, but in the small, dusty form of her 17-year-old brother, Thomas. He appeared one afternoon at the edge of the clearing, looking thin and nervous, twisting a worn hat in his hands. Emma's heart leaped at the sight of him, a complex mix of love and apprehension. "Thomas," she cried, running to embrace him. "What are you doing all the way out here?" He hugged her back stiffly, his eyes darting toward the cabin, toward Caleb, who had stopped his work and was watching them with his usual impassive vigilance. "Ma sent me," Thomas mumbled, not meeting her eyes. "She's worried sick. Pa, too." She led him to the shade of a large pine, offering him a drink from the water dipper. "Worried about what? I'm fine. I'm more than fine." "It's the talk, Emma," he said, his voice low and miserable. "In town. It's bad." He finally looked at her, his young face etched with shame. "They're saying wicked things, that you're living out here with him, alone, that you've ruined yourself. Mrs. Gable told Ma that no decent man will have you now." Each word was a small, sharp stone. Emma felt a cold dread seep into her bones. She had been so insulated in her new life that she had forgotten the power of the old one, the power of whispers and reputations in a town as small as Redemption. And that's not all. Thomas pressed on, clearly desperate to deliver his message and be gone. "Ma and Pa, they want you to come home. Right now. Mr. Henderson, the baker. He says his offer for you still stands. He's willing to overlook everything if you come back and marry his son. Silas." Silas Henderson, a doughy, soft-handed boy with a vacant stare. The thought of him, of that life, was like a cage door slamming shut. "They want to sell me off to save face," Emma said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They want to save you asterisk," Thomas insisted, his voice cracking. "They think you're in trouble. They think that man has you under some kind of spell." Emma looked back at the cabin. Caleb was still there. A silent, unmovable figure against the backdrop of the forest. A spell. No. He had simply given her a place where she could be herself. He had shown her respect. He had, in his own quiet way, shown her love. How could she ever explain that to them? "Tell them I will think on it," she said, her voice firmer than she felt, her duty to her family. A cord she thought she had severed was pulling at her, tight and painful. The weight of their shame was a heavy burden to place on her newfound happiness. As her brother trudged back toward town, a new, more menacing shadow was gathering. For days, Caleb had been uneasy. He'd found tracks by the spring that were not his own prints of shod horses where there should have been none. One night, as they sat by the fire, the distant sound of rough laughter had drifted on the wind. A discordant, ugly sound that had made the hair on his arms stand up. The land was telling him they were no longer alone. They were a trio of hard-faced men, drifters who lived on the edges of the law, taking what they wanted and moving on. Their leader was a man named Jedediah, with cold, reptilian eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. They had been driven from the mining camps to the north and were looking for a place to lie low, a place that was isolated, with resources worth taking. From a high ridge, they had watched the cabin for days. They saw the sturdy horses, the wisp of smoke from the chimney that promised food and warmth. And most of all, they saw the woman. Two men like them. A woman alone with one man in the wilderness was a sign of weakness, an opportunity. Caleb's growing fear for Emma was a constant, gnawing ache. He had known love, and he had known the soul-crushing agony of loss. The thought of losing her, of seeing her hurt, was a terror far greater than any storm. This fear made him retreat into himself. He became more silent, his face perpetually grim, his rifle now a permanent extension of his arm. He shadowed her constantly. When she went to the garden, he would be nearby, sharpening an axe. When she went to the spring, he would follow at a distance, concealed by the trees. Emma felt the change in him, but she misunderstood its source. She thought his withdrawal was a reaction to her brother's visit. She believed he was putting distance between them, reminding her that she was, after all, just hired help, that she had a family and a life to return to. The thought was a cold stone in her heart, creating a painful rift between them even as the external threats drew closer. The confrontation, when it came, was as sudden and brutal as a lightning strike. It was late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the clearing. Emma had gone to the spring for the last bucket of water for the day. She was lost in her own troubled thoughts, torn between her family's demands and her heart's desire. When their voices cut through the quiet rustle of the aspens, "Well now, what do we have here?" She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Two of the drifters stood there, blocking her path back to the cabin. Jedediah was in the lead, a predatory smile on his face. The other man was big and brutish, his eyes lingering on her in a way that made her feel ill. "Just a pretty little thing, all alone in the woods," Jedediah said. his voice a greasy drawl. He took a step closer. "You look awful thirsty, darlin'. Maybe we could help you with that bucket." Emma clutched the wooden handle, her knuckles white. She stood her ground, her fear a cold fire in her belly. "I'm not your darlin'," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "Leave me be." "Feisty," the big man chuckled. "I like 'em feisty." Jedediah's smile widened. "See, we've been watching this place. Seems to us that old fella you're with ain't proper company for a lady. A woman needs protection, the right kind of protection." He took another step, his intent clear. Emma backed away, her heel hitting the slick stones at the edge of the spring. There was nowhere to run. Her mind raced, searching for an escape, for a weapon. There was nothing. Just the bucket, the water, and the two menacing figures closing in on her. "She's not alone." The voice was low, dangerously quiet, and it came from the trees behind them. It was Caleb. He stepped into the clearing, his rifle held loosely at his side, but his movements were anything but casual. He moved with the deadly grace of a panther, his pale eyes fixed on the two men, burning with a cold, lethal fury. Jedediah and his companion froze, turning to face this new threat. They were armed with pistols at their belts, but Caleb's rifle was a more serious weapon at this range, and there was a look in his eyes that promised he knew how to use it. "Well now, Miller," Jedediah sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "Didn't mean to trespass on your claim. We were just making the lady's acquaintance." "Your acquaintance is finished," Caleb said, his voice flat and hard as granite. He took a step forward, placing himself between them and Emma. "Get on your horses and ride. Don't come back." Jedediah's eyes narrowed. He was sizing Caleb up, weighing the odds. He was used to intimidating men, but this one was different. There was no fear in him, only a chilling, absolute resolve. He saw the way Caleb's body was angled, shielding Emma, and he saw the white-knuckled grip on the rifle stock. This man would not hesitate. "This ain't over," Jedediah snarled, deciding to retreat for now. "This land's got a way of taking what it wants." He and his man backed away slowly, their eyes still locked on Caleb, before melting back into the shadows of the forest. The moment they were gone, Caleb's iron composure broke. He turned to Emma, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly. He rushed to her side, his eyes scanning her frantically. "Did they touch you? Are you hurt?" "No," she whispered, her own body shaking with the aftermath of terror. "I'm all right. You came." He reached out, his hands hovering for a moment before he gripped her shoulders, his touch both fierce and incredibly gentle. He pulled her against him, a rough, desperate embrace that spoke more than words ever could. She could feel the wild, frantic beating of his heart against her cheek. He wasn't just angry, he was terrified. Terrified for her, and in that moment, all of Emma's confusion, all of her turmoil, vanished. His coldness, his distance over the past days, it wasn't him pushing her away. It was this. It was his all-consuming fear of losing her. She saw with absolute clarity the depth of his love, a love so powerful he was willing to stand against armed men without a flicker of hesitation, a love so profound that the thought of her being harmed shattered his formidable control. Her own choice became devastatingly simple. The whispers of the town, the demands of her family, they were nothing. They were shadows. The reality was here, in the solid feel of his arms around her, in the fierce, protective love in his eyes. This was her home. This was her family. He released her, though he kept his hands on her arms, as if to assure himself she was real. "Let's go back to the cabin," he said, his voice still ragged. They walked back through the fading light, the threat of the drifters a palpable presence in the woods around them. The shadows were gathering, both literally and figuratively. But for the first time, Caleb and Emma were ready to face them together, their unspoken love now forged into an unbreakable shield. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 6. Climax, Blood and Choice, asterisk, asterisk. Night fell on the cabin not as a gentle blanket, but as a drawn shroud. The familiar, comforting darkness was gone, replaced by a malevolent blackness that seemed to cling to the very logs of the walls. Every shadow held a threat. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a footstep. Inside, the air was thick with a tension so palpable it was almost impossible to breathe. They had barred the door with a heavy log, shuttered the single window, and extinguished the lantern, leaving the hearths low, flickering embers as their only light. Caleb moved with a predatory stillness, a man transformed. The quiet homesteader was gone, replaced by a sentinel, a warrior defending his last bastion. He stood near the wall, his rifle cradled in his arms, his senses tuned to the night. Emma sat by the hearth, another loaded rifle across her lap. He had shown her how to use it weeks ago, explaining the mechanics with a grim, practical patience. "You point, you squeeze, don't jerk it," he'd said. "Hope you never need to." Now, the cold, heavy weight of the weapon was a terrifying reality. The waiting was its own form of torture. An hour passed, then two. The silence stretched, fraying their nerves. Emma's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought of her brother's plea, of her family's shame, of the soft, easy life she could have had with Silas Henderson. It all seemed like a story about a stranger. Her reality was here, in this dark, silent room, waiting for violence alongside a man she had come to love more than life itself. There was no longer a choice to be made. Her choice had been made the moment he had stepped between her and Jedediah's sneer. The attack, when it came, started not with a bang, but with a voice. Miller Jedediah's greasy drawl slithered out of the darkness, seeming to come from all directions at once. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got the girl with you. Send her out, and we might just let you live." Caleb didn't answer. He remained a statue of stone and shadow, his eyes scanning the darkness through a small chink in the wall. "Don't be a fool," the voice taunted. "We saw you coming back from town, saw all them pretty supplies. We'll take the supplies, we'll take the horses, and we'll take the woman. It's gonna happen one way or another." A heavy rock thudded against the shuttered window, making Emma jump, a small gasp escaping her lips. "She sounds scared in there." "Miller," another voice laughed. "This one deeper, more brutish. You ain't man enough to keep her safe." Caleb's voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, chilling rumble that cut through their taunts. "You've made your last mistake," he said, the words a quiet promise of death. The answer was a flash of orange in the darkness, followed by the deafening crack of a pistol. A lead ball slammed into the log just above Caleb's head, sending splinters flying. The siege had begun. Another shot, then another. They were firing from the cover of the trees, trying to intimidate, to draw him out. Then Emma saw a flicker of movement near the corner of the cabin, a dark shape moving low to the ground. She saw a spark, then a growing orange glow. "Caleb, fire!" she screamed, pointing. "The wall!" He didn't need a second warning. He moved to the other side of the room, aimed, and fired his rifle. The weapon's roar filled the cabin, a deafening concussion of sound and fury. A scream of pain and surprise echoed from the darkness. He had hit one of them, but the torch had found its mark. A small lick of flame began to crawl up the dry, seasoned logs of the wall. The cabin, their home, their fortress, was turning into a trap. "The water bucket," Caleb yelled, already reloading with swift, practiced hands. Panic tried to claw its way up Emma's throat, but she shoved it down. She scrambled for the bucket, her mind a blaze of focused terror, while Caleb laid down suppressing fire, forcing the men to stay under cover. She threw the contents of the bucket against the burning wall. The flames hissed and sputtered, and for a moment she thought she'd succeeded, but they were too stubborn. The fire had taken hold. The smoke began to fill the room, acrid and stinging. Through the haze, Emma saw the brutish one, the man who had chuckled at her fear. making a desperate run for the door. He was carrying a heavy log, intending to use it as a battering ram. Caleb saw him too. He swung the rifle around, but just as he pulled the trigger, Jedediah fired from the trees. The bullet ripped through the shutter, shattering the glass pane behind it and ricocheting off the stone hearth. The distraction was enough. Caleb's shot went wide, and the brute was at the door, slamming the log against it with a sickening crunch. The bar held, but the wood of the door itself splintered. Another blow, and the hinges groaned in protest. They were coming in. Caleb tried to reload, his fingers fumbling for a cartridge in the thick smoke. The brute drew his pistol, preparing to fire through the splintered hole in the door the moment it gave way. Caleb was exposed, a clear target. He was out of time. In that instant, the world slowed for Emma. She saw Caleb, his face grim in the hellish light of the fire, fighting a losing battle. She saw the door about to burst open. She saw the life they had built together, the fragile peace, the unspoken love, all about to be consumed by violence and flames. A path of escape flickered in her mind, a small, unlocked storage hatch at the back of the cabin. She could slip out, lose herself in the darkness of the woods, survive. But to survive alone was not to live. The thought was a lightning strike of absolute clarity. She looked at the spare rifle in her hands. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her resolve was a fire that burned even hotter than the one consuming their home. She lifted the rifle. It was heavy, unwieldy. She propped the barrel on a crate to steady her shaking hands, just as Caleb had once shown her. She looked down the long barrel, through the smoke and the chaos, and found the dark, hulking shape of the man at the door. He raised the log for a final, decisive blow. Emma took a breath, held it, remembered Caleb's words *point, squeeze, don't jerk it *, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked back against her shoulder with the force of a mule, a brutal, shocking impact that sent a jolt of pain up her arm. The roar of the shot was deafening. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard a choked cry of agony and the heavy thud of the log hitting the ground. The assault on the door stopped. Silence. The sudden absence of noise was more shocking than the gunfire. Then, Jedediah's voice, screaming a curse from the woods. "Elias, Elias, you blasted fool!" Caleb stared, momentarily stunned. From the now silent door to Emma, who was still kneeling, the rifle clutched in her hands, her face pale but resolute in the firelight. He looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. The spell was broken by a furious volley of shots from the woods as Jedediah provided cover for his retreat. They heard him dragging the wounded man away, his voice a stream of venomous curses that faded into the night. They were gone. But the fire was not. It had spread, a hungry beast devouring the corner of the cabin. The smoke was now a thick, choking blanket. They grabbed the spare water buckets, the blankets from their beds, anything they could find, and attacked the flames. They worked as a single entity, their movements synchronized, their purpose absolute. They beat at the flames, threw water, stamped out embers, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming. Finally, a last defiant tongue of fire hissed and died. The battle was over. They stood in the center of their ravaged home, leaning on each other, gasping for air. Moonlight streamed through the splintered door and the bullet holes, illuminating a scene of devastation. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder. One corner of the cabin was a blackened, charred skeleton of logs. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a torrent of emotion. Caleb turned to Emma. He gently took the rifle from her trembling hands and set it aside. He cupped her face, his thumbs wiping away the soot from her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and she saw everything there, the terror he had felt, the relief that was washing over him, and a love so fierce and overwhelming it left her breathless. "Emma," he said, his voice ragged, broken. He struggled for the words. The simple, honest words he had kept locked away for so long. They could have killed you. You could have run. I wasn't leaving you, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. This is my home. His control finally shattered. You are my home, he said, his voice raw with a love that could no longer be contained. Emma, I love you. The words, so long unspoken, hung in the smoky air, more powerful than any gunshot. They were the truth that had been forged in the fire. Tears streamed freely down Emma's face, washing clean paths through the grime. I love you too. Caleb, she sobbed. I love you. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and survival, of gratitude and fierce, unyielding love. It was hungry and deep, a claiming and a surrender all at once. It tasted of smoke and sweat and gunpowder, the very elements of the trial that had forged them into one. They clung to each other in the ruins of their cabin, two solitary souls who had found each other in the wilderness and had fought, side by side, to defend the home they had built not just of logs and daub, but of trust, courage, and a love that had been tested by fire. Asterisk, asterisk, Part 7. Falling Action, The Revival. Asterisk, asterisk. Dawn arrived not with a gentle blush, but as a stark, unforgiving witness. The first rays of sun sliced through the shattered door and the bullet-riddled shutters, illuminating a scene of quiet devastation. The air, thick with the ghosts of smoke and gunpowder, was cold. The fire had been vanquished, but its scar was a gaping, blackened wound in the corner of their home. Shards of glass glittered on the floor like malevolent frost, and the entire cabin bore the marks of their desperate battle. They had not slept. After the fire was out, they had simply held each other, their bodies humming with the aftermath of adrenaline and a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Now, in the gray light, the reality of their situation settled upon them. They were alive. They were together, but their sanctuary was broken. Caleb moved first. He rose stiffly, every muscle protesting, and went to the hearth. He coaxed the embers back to life, the small act of nurturing a flame, a quiet defiance against the destruction around them. Emma followed, her movements slow and deliberate. She found the coffee pot, miraculously unharmed, and began the familiar ritual of making their morning coffee. There was no discussion, no planning. Their shared purpose was an unspoken current that flowed between them. They would rebuild. That first day was about triage. They dragged the scorched, ruined logs out into the clearing, a grim funeral pyre for the part of their home they had lost. The work was brutal, their hands raw, their faces smudged with soot. Yet it was different from all the labor that had come before. A new intimacy bound them. When a heavy, charred beam threatened to slip from Emma's grasp, Caleb's hand was instantly there, covering hers, their combined strength easily managing the load. He didn't let go immediately, his fingers lacing through hers for a brief, reassuring moment. Words, once so sparse, now came easily, soft words of encouragement, quiet murmurs of concern. Careful there, he'd say, his voice a low rumble. Let me take that. And she would reply with a tired but genuine smile. We'll take it together. Their love, confessed in the heat of battle, was now being lived in the quiet, arduous work of rebuilding. It was in the way he brought her a dipper of water without her asking, and the way she bandaged a long splinter in his hand, her touch gentle and sure, while they worked to restore their isolated world. The consequences of their fight were rippling outward, miles away. In the dusty streets of redemption, Jedediah dragged his wounded companion, Elias, to the door of Doc Miller. The doctor, a man accustomed to patching up the results of drunken brawls and farming accidents, took one look at the ugly, ragged hole in Elias's leg, and his face grew grim. This is a rifle wound. stuck," Miller stated, his voice sharp. "And a bad one. Looks to be festering already." "We had a disagreement with a fella out in the hills," Jedediah snarled. "His story already prepared. A crazy old hermit. Miller's his name. We were just passing through, and he opened fire on us for no reason." The story spread through Redemption like a fever. Caleb Miller, the strange, grieving widower, had finally gone completely mad. He'd shot a man in cold blood, and worse, he was holding that poor, foolish Thorn girl captive. The town's gossip, once a brew of pity and scorn, now thickened with fear and outrage. The whispers that had once condemned Emma for her lack of propriety now painted her as a helpless victim. Sheriff Brody, a practical man with a healthy skepticism for stories told by men like Jedediah, listened to the tale with a non-committal grunt. He agreed to ride out to the Miller place, not just to investigate the shooting, but to rescue the Thorn girl. A small posse of concerned townsmen, including a guilt-ridden Mr. Abernathy from the general store, insisted on joining him. They arrived at the cabin 2 days after the attack. They came expecting to find a scene of madness, perhaps a hostage situation. Instead, what they saw stopped them in their tracks. The corner of the cabin was clearly fire-damaged. The new, pale wood of replacement logs standing in stark contrast to the weathered gray of the old. The door was off its hinges, leaning against the wall, and in the middle of this scene of recent violence stood Caleb and Emma, working together to fit a new window frame. They were dirty, exhausted, and bruised, but they were not victim and captor. They were partners. Emma held the frame steady while Caleb carefully hammered it into place, their movements displaying an easy, practiced synchronicity. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his hand resting warily on his pistol. "Miller," he called out, "we need a word." Caleb slowly lowered his hammer, his body tensing. He moved to stand slightly in front of Emma, a subtle, protective gesture. Emma, however, did not cower behind him. She stood her ground, her chin held high, her gaze clear and defiant. She looked at the men from her town, men who had judged her, and felt not fear, but a weary anger. "There's a man in town with a hole in his leg. Miller," the sheriff said, his eyes taking in the bullet holes that riddled the cabin walls. "Says you put it there." Caleb's expression was like flint. "He was trying to break down my door. He and 2 others. They tried to burn us out." Mr. Abernathy, his face pale, stepped forward. "Emma, Miss Thorn. Are you all right? Did he force you to stay here?" Emma looked directly at the store owner, the man who had treated her with such disdain. "Force me," she said, her voice ringing with a strength none of them had ever heard from her. "Mr. Abernathy, I fought beside him. I held a rifle and I used it. These men attacked our home." She deliberately used the word "our," a claim that was as clear as a pistol shot. The men in the posse looked at each other, their certainty beginning to crumble. They saw the evidence before them, the fire. The bullet holes peppering the walls asterisk from the outside asterisk. The splintered remains of the old door. This wasn't the scene of an ambush. It was the scene of a siege. They saw the unwavering loyalty in Emma's eyes as she looked at Caleb, and they saw the fierce, protective love in his as he looked at her. The story they had been told in town fell apart in the face of this undeniable truth. They were not looking at a madman and his victim. They were looking at 2 people who had faced down death together and had won. Emma Thorn was not a ruined woman. She was a survivor, a hero. Sheriff Brody, a fair man, slowly took his hand off his gun. "I reckon Jedediah left a few details out of his story," he said, his voice holding a new note of respect. "You need any help with the repairs?" Caleb shook his head. "We'll manage." The posse turned and rode away, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. They had come to pass judgment and had instead been forced to bear witness. As they disappeared, a great weight seemed to lift from Emma's shoulders, the final tie to the life she had left behind. The fear of its judgment had been severed. She was free. The next few days were filled with the healing balm of hard work, as they rebuilt the wall. Log by log, they were also rebuilding their lives, stronger and more resilient than before. One afternoon, they were fitting the last and highest log into place. It was a difficult, awkward task. Emma was on the ladder, guiding it, while Caleb pushed from below. "A little to the left," she instructed, her voice steady. "There. Perfect." With a final, concerted shove, the log settled into place. Completing the wall, they had done it. Their home was whole again. Caleb stood back, looking up at their work, his face smudged with dirt but his eyes clear. He turned to look at Emma, who was still on the ladder, her face flushed with triumph. "A house needs a solid wall," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the still afternoon air. "It does," she agreed, smiling down at him. "It needs a roof over its head and a fire in the hearth," he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "But it's not a home, not until it has a family. It needs a wife. Emma." He didn't move. He didn't get down on one knee. He simply stood there, his heart in his eyes, stating a fact as plain and solid as the log they had just set. It was the most honest, most beautiful proposal she could have ever imagined. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She scrambled down the ladder and walked right into his arms, wrapping her own around his neck. "Yes," she whispered against his chest. "Yes, Caleb, it does." He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, a low, ragged sigh of relief escaping him. The war was over. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The outside world had been faced down. Here, in the shelter of the walls they had rebuilt with their own hands, their future was finally beginning. Asterisk, asterisk, part sewoit. Resolution: a house, a home, asterisk, asterisk. The wedding was not a grand affair. There was no white lace, no swelling organ music, only the plain, sturdy fabric of Emma's spare dress and the quiet dignity of two people who had earned their happiness through trial by fire. They rode into redemption a week after Caleb's proposal, not as outcasts, but as a unit, their presence commanding a new, unspoken respect. The story of their siege had become a local legend, transforming Emma from a foolish girl into a frontier heroine and Caleb from a mad hermit into a man who had defended his home with legendary resolve. They were met not with whispers, but with quiet, curious nods. Mr. Abernathy, his face a mixture of awe and contrition, gifted them a heavy cast-iron skillet as a wedding present. Sheriff Brody stood as Caleb's witness, his handshake firm and genuine. Emma's family was there, summoned by a note she had sent with a passing trapper. Her mother wept, a torrent of relief and pride, while her father, leaning on his cane, looked at Caleb not as the man who had stolen his daughter, but as the man who had given her a life he never could have. He saw the strength in Emma's eyes, the deep, abiding love she held for the quiet man at her side, and he gave them his gruff, heartfelt blessing. They were married by a circuit judge in the dusty town hall, their vows simple, direct, and unbreakable. They were not promises of ease or riches, but of steadfastness, of partnership, of facing whatever the harsh land threw at them, together. When they rode out of town, it was not as a man and his hired help, but as husband and wife, their future stretching before them like the open, sunlit plains. The seasons that followed were a testament to their shared purpose. The cabin, once a symbol of loneliness and decay, was reborn. The scar from the fire was covered with fresh, sweet-smelling cedar logs, stronger than the original wall had ever been. Caleb, with a skill Emma had never suspected, built a long, covered porch along the front. It became their favorite place, a space between the shelter of their home and the wild beauty of the land. Emma's garden, no longer a small, defiant patch, expanded into a sprawling testament to her care. It was a riot of color and life, providing them with beans, squash, corn, and potatoes to last through the winter, and rows of brilliant marigolds and sturdy zinnias that brought a splash of defiant joy to the rugged landscape. The lone corral was joined by a second, and a small, sturdy barn began to take shape. Built from timber Caleb felled and hewed himself. The homestead was no longer just surviving, it was thriving. The man who lived there thrived as well. The grief that had carved such deep lines into Caleb's face began to soften. The guarded emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a warm, steady light, a light that shone brightest when he looked at his wife. He was still a man of few words, but his silence was now a comfortable, contented thing. He learned to laugh again, a low, rumbling sound that Emma cherished. He would watch her move about her day, a small, secret smile on his lips, and she would feel his love like a physical warmth, a constant, reassuring presence. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer haunted him. They had become a gentle, sorrowful part of his history, a history he could now share without being consumed by it. Emma, too, had completed her own transformation. The girl who had arrived seeking escape from a predetermined life had found something far greater, a life she had chosen and built with her own 2 hands. She was no longer defined by the town's narrow expectations or her family's poverty. She was Mrs. Miller, a title she wore with a quiet, unassailable pride. She was a partner in every sense of the word. Her opinions sought, her strength valued, her courage a known fact. She had found that true independence wasn't about being alone, but about finding the one person with whom you could be entirely, completely yourself. One cool evening in late autumn, a year after their wedding, Caleb led her by the hand to the small, fenced-off plot behind the cabin. The 2 simple wooden crosses stood sentinel under the vast, star-dusted sky. Emma had always respected this space, leaving Caleb to his private grief, but tonight was different. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands, Emma's hand held firmly in his own. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and clear, carrying on the crisp night air. "This is Emma. She brought the light back." He looked at the smaller cross. "Daniel, my boy, she sings your lullaby sometimes." He wasn't speaking to ghosts. He was speaking to memories, integrating his past with his present. He was showing them that his heart had not forgotten them, but that it had found a way to beat again, to love again. Emma felt a wave of profound love for this man, for his deep, quiet heart and his unyielding loyalty. She knelt and placed a small, late-blooming wildflower she had picked from her garden at the base of each cross. It was not a gesture of replacement, but of inclusion, a sign that this new family was honoring the old. They stood there for a long time, not in sadness, but in a shared, peaceful silence. A family of 4 under the watchful eyes of the stars. The years flowed on, etching themselves into the land and into their lives. The cabin stood strong, a testament to their endurance. The garden flourished. The barn was filled with hay. Life was not easy. There were droughts and blizzards, sickness and setbacks, but they faced it all together. Their love a bedrock foundation that could not be shaken. One perfect summer evening, they sat on the porch Caleb had built, their chairs close together. The sun was a great, molten ball of orange, sinking behind the distant, jagged hills, setting the sky ablaze. The air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of pine and the rich, dark earth of Emma's garden. A comfortable silence lay between them, the language of a love that needed no words. Caleb reached over and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The hand he held was no longer the soft, unblemished hand of a town girl, but the strong, capable hand of a woman who knew the feel of an axe, a rifle, and a spade. He looked at her face, softened by the golden light of the sunset, and saw the same fierce spirit that had first marched into his clearing, but now it was tempered with a deep, abiding peace. Emma leaned her head against his shoulder, her body fitting perfectly against his. She looked out at the vast, beautiful wilderness that stretched before them. It was no longer a place of threat or hardship. It was home. The wind, which had once spoken to her of escape, now whispered of contentment. This lonely cabin had needed help. She had arrived, seeking a wage and a chance to prove her worth, and in the heart of the wild, untamed West, in a place of solitude and struggle, she had gained so much more. She had gained love, a husband, and a home. Together, they had taken a place of sorrow and neglect and, with their own hands and their own hearts, had built a lasting sanctuary. They had proven that even in the harshest soil, with enough courage, enough work, and enough love, a beautiful life could grow. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from. So please share your city or country in the comments below to connect with fellow fans and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if you'd like to give this story an extra boost, please consider hitting the hype button. It helps our tales reach more listeners just like you.